So we've talked a little bit about unconscious bias and implicit bias. Now, what I'd like to spend some time talking with you about is this idea of cognitive control. So, what is cognitive control? So, we recognize that unconscious bias is that bias that I may not, as an individual, be aware of. Implicit bias is that bias that is tucked inside of our organizations, that become a part of our policies or our procedures, that we're not even really thinking about the negative impacts of these kinds of things, right? And so it's that individual bias that's been baked into our organizations. Well, ultimately, what we want is cognitive control, right? What we want is cognitive control. So the first thing that I'd like for you to do is when you look at this picture in your workbook, I want you to count the number of triangles in that first that first diagram there, right? So count the number of triangles. So typically, when people do this, when I've done this with people, there are people who will count two triangles. There are people who will count eight triangles, 11 triangles. Okay, so before you blurt out the number that you came to, because I hope you wrote that down somewhere, and if you haven't, go ahead and just write that number down. What number did you come up with, and just write that down on your paper. So before you blurt that out, or as you're writing that down, what I would like to do is just back up for a second and talk about what a triangle is, right? So what is it that makes up a triangle? Or what are the aspects of a triangle? Well, first, it is an object that has three sides. Would you agree? Yeah. So right? So three sides. It also has three corners. Is that correct? Yep. So three sides, three corners, or 3 points, right? Is the triangle an open object or a closed object? Meaning, is there space to go in any of? Okay, it is a closed object. All right. So you've written the number of triangles down. We've now defined triangles. What I'd like for you to do now is to go back to that triangle and count the number of triangles given our definition. Many of you got it like right away, right? There are, in fact, how many triangles? None. There are no triangles at all. But why did we say that? Why did we? A number of us, particularly when I first did it, I was like counting the number of triangles. Why did we do that? Because of our Gestalt psychology, right? Our Gestalt psychology, which means that Gestalt psychology is a way of thinking, or that allows us or our brain to close objects that are open. So if there's any ambiguity in a situation, if there aren't things that are resolved, our brain will kick in and start to resolve those things. It will create answers when, in fact, there may not be an answer. Right. And so that Gestalt psychology is that our mind is constantly trying to close shapes, have answers to things, resolve things. And so it doesn't like that ambiguity. However, what changed between when you first saw it and then we defined the triangle and then you reanalyzed the triangle, right? You took cognitive control. Right. So going back to a set of standards that is previously defined and weighing our observation against that standard provided us with a way to take control of our minds and have cognitive control. Right. So another way to think about cognitive control. How many people are afraid of snakes, spiders? Right. For me, it's mice, and it's not the fact that the mouse is scary to me or anything like that. It's the scurrying, right? It's the little fast movement that it does that is just unnerving. Like, ugh. So let's say you're in an important meeting with the board of governors, or the board of your organization, and they've invited you to come and do a presentation, and the successful execution of that presentation means that your organization won't have need for money because they'll provide you the money for the next 8 months, and they'll just write a check and 8 months, right? So you're preparing to give the presentation, and that critter, whether it's a snake or a spider or a mouse, and you see it enter the room. What do you do? Oh, first, let's back up. What would your natural inclination be? Right. So for some people, it would be, leave the room. For other people, it would be jump up on the table. For others, it would be a screech. Ah! Right. That's your natural inclination. However, there's a lot on the line here. So what would you start to do so that you gained cognitive control, right? So for me, I would start thinking, how do I distance myself from this critter, right? Or what blockages can I use to, protect myself from this critter? Who can I alert to the presence of this critter, right? So I start problem solving because my organization really needs this money, and I can't not seem professional in this environment, right? So I get cognitive control. And so, although we have fears, although we have unconscious bias, although sometimes in our organizations we have this implicit bias, it behooves us to think critically about how do we analyze those things, analyze that unconscious bias and that implicit bias so that we can take control of it, so we can still achieve our goals. So let's talk a little bit about two forms of unconscious bias. First is in-group, out-group bias, which is this notion that the in-group has a certain so let's go back. Let's back up for a second. In K-12 education in the United States, what group in a high school typically gets the most benefits or the access to services, the most honor, the most praise, for a lack of a better term? It's typically the athletes, right? And so depending on where you grew up, it could be football, it could be basketball, it could be volleyball or ice hockey, right? So depending on where you are, that's kind of the hierarchy. And then there are other groups that are also in that K-12 school that don't get the same level of adoration or praise or even conversations about how they're doing and their numbers and stats, right? And so groups oftentimes, and again, this is depending on where you grew up, sometimes it's like the band club, right? Or the golf club, or the Actors Guild, right? So oftentimes the in group is perceived to be like the athletes, and then all other groups are somewhat the out groups. Well, that also happens in our organizations, right? So we have in groups and we have out groups. Sometimes they're based on race, sometimes they're based on seniority, sometimes they're based on skill, but the in group is typically seen as having favor, and the out group not so much, right? And so part of what we have to fight against is this affinity bias. And so in your workbook, there's a page that I'd like for you to work through about this in-group and out-group phenomenon. And then there's also this idea or the concept of double standards. Are there ways, and you'll see this on another page in your workbook, but are there ways that we can look at the same information from two different individuals, the same information, but draw different conclusions based on how we see their presentation, right? Is that possible? And it is, and it's called double standard, right? So it's the double standard bias. And then there's also the culture fit bias. and we'll talk a little bit about the culture fit bias, and that basically is oftentimes we'll say, particularly at the end of an interview, that this person was not a good fit, which is interesting because they oftentimes we haven't shared what the fit is on the front end, but we want to judge people on the back end of not fitting in, but we've never declared or even decided among the team what we're actually looking for in terms of that fit, right? So we'll spend some time talking about that. And then lastly, in this particular section, I want to talk a little bit about discretionary effort. And discretionary effort is so you pay me to do a job, right? And I will get my paycheck if I do it at least at 75% or above. I will still get paid, right? However, most employers would suggest that they want much more than 75%. They at least want 100%. So between 75% and 100% is at my discretion. Whether I give 75% or 100% is at my discretion. And we call that discretionary effort. And what we know is that discretionary effort typically it comes in relationship to other things outside of the duties that are assigned, right? And so when we think about unconscious bias, if unconscious bias is high, then cognitive control is probably low. But if cognitive control is high, then unconscious bias is probably relatively low. We see the same with microaggressions and discretionary effort. So as microaggressions are higher, we'll recognize that discretionary effort is low. However, if we can increase discretionary effort, we recognize that can only happen when there's a decrease in microaggressions. And the same goes with conflict and communication, right? Conflict typically is high when communication is low. But when communication becomes high, then conflict typically is greatly reduced, right? So this idea of discretionary effort. So when we're working with people, when we're interviewing, when we're on our teams, we have to be mindful that discretionary effort is giving us information about what what the atmosphere is like within our culture, within our organization. So pay close attention to discretionary effort. And then how do we increase that discretionary effort? And then many of us may be familiar with Johari's window and blind spots. And so I'll let you spend some time in your worksheets working through this yourself. But the basic premise of this is that there are Johari's window gives us ways to think about our blind spots and how to remove those blind spots, not so that we can be judged or that we can judge others, but that we can increase our effectiveness as we move through a process of interviewing and working with people.